go ahead and press D a few times to duplicate this cube so we have some items to work with. Then I'm going to zoom out here. So to select everything, all we do is tap A, and that will select all. Now tapping A again will not deselect everything, it only selects everything. Keep in mind that it's actually really rare that you'll ever need to first deselect everything and then select something else. Usually the case is that when you're going from a selection of a bunch of things, you really need to just have the next object you're going to be working on selected. And that already happens when you click on something without holding shift. So say I wanted to just work on this object rather than this big selection, I just select that object rather than having to deselect everything, then select that. However, you can deselect all by double clicking anywhere off of an object in the 3D view, and you can also select all by doing that. So we can toggle selecting all and deselecting all by double clicking anywhere off of an object. However, when we tap A, we can always rely on it to immediately select everything. Now, a lasso select is an additive selection. Basically, the more items you select with the lasso selection, it will add to that selection. You don't have to hold shift or anything. So I'll double click here to deselect everything. So if I were to hold control and use my right mouse to lasso select these two objects here, they're selected. And then if I hold control and drag my right mouse button around these two objects, they're added to that selection, and I don't have to hold shift or anything. We can do a box selection by first pressing B, and when we do that, we see these little crosshairs, and then we can click and drag a box over the items which we want to select. Now, this is not an additive. It basically acts like a regular selection, only the items that we click become selected. So right now I have like these 5 objects here selected, but if I just click on one of them, then everything else gets deselected unless I'm holding shift. And so when we do a box selection, whatever we select in that box becomes the only thing that's selected, and everything else gets deselected. Of all these selection methods, my favorite is actually the circle selection. If we hold down C, then this will bring up our circle select brush. And basically this lets us paint on selections, which is awesome. This is also additive, meaning that when you start painting a selection, it won't first deselect everything else. So if I were to click on here and just drag my mouse, then these items get selected. And so as soon as we let go of that, we're back to our regular mouse view. So this allows us to really quickly rotate, zoom in, pan the screen, move around, and make these selections. Now we can increase the size of this brush when we hold down C by scrolling back or scrolling up like this. And this helps us make a lot of selections really quickly. And we can also deselect by painting holding the middle mouse button down rather than the left mouse button down to add. So the middle mouse button deselects objects. So let's tap A to select everything, X to delete it all, press Shift A to bring up our add menu, and under mesh I'm going to add a monkey head. Then I'm going to press S to scale this up a bit and tap W a few times to give it some smoothing. Okay, so if we press tab to go into edit mode now, we can use all of these same selection methods in edit mode. So I can double click off of the object to deselect all of the mesh or reselect it by double clicking. If I click on one of these faces here, I can hold control and right mouse to do a lasso selection such as this. And I can do that for faces, edges, or vertex points. So if I were to shift scroll down for vertex selection, I can hold control and right mouse to lasso select these points like this. I can do a box select by pressing B and selecting things like that. And of course, I can use my circle select brush by holding C, and I'll just scroll that down a bit so it's not so big and add to selections in this way. And once again, this is extremely useful in edit mode. So I'm going to make this mesh a bit more complicated so that we can have some more things to select. So I'm going to tap A to select everything here and just tap W to do a subdivision. And now we have a lot more faces and things to select here. So I want to talk about making selections that go all the way through your object. So if I were to press 1 to go into front view and then zoom in on here, say I wanted to select this bottom mouth area of this monkey head. So if I were to double click to deselect everything and then press B to do a box select and select across this front here, this selection by default will only select these front faces. So if I zoom away down here in my camera view so we can have another angle, you see that the faces around this corner here were not selected. So to do a selection that cuts all the way through, you need to either press Z to go into wireframe mode, and this is typically what I will do to do these type of selections. So this time if we were to press B for a box select and then click and drag a selection over across this area here, we see that all of these are now selected here. And I see that I selected a few things I maybe don't want selected there. So what I could do is hold C to bring up my circle select, and then scroll that brush size down a little bit, and then hold down my middle mouse button to remove some of those selections there. Whether we're in vertex, edge, or face selection, so I could tap space to do face selection, we can select all the way through when we are in wireframe mode like this. So if I press Z to go back into solid viewport shading, another way we can select all the way through is by unchecking this button right here, this limit selection to visible button. And this now lets us see our mesh as well as actual edges, vertex points, and faces for us to select. And so we can also make selections that cut all the way through here. So if I were to double click anywhere off of here to deselect and then hold Control and then right click a big circle of stuff here in the middle, as we can see here, this select all these things in the front of the monkey head as well as the back. Typically, working like this can get a little confusing, so I like to leave this turned on, and then if I need to make a selection that goes all the way through, I just tap Z, do my selection, tap Z again, and then I'm done. So that's how I kind of like to handle that. So we can also do an inverse selection. Basically, we can make everything that's not selected selected and everything that's selected not selected by pressing Control I, which is a common hotkey in a lot of programs. Sometimes it's Control Shift I, but that stands for inverse. So we can inverse the selection by pressing Control I. And also down here, most of the options we talked about, their hotkeys can be chosen manually here if, say, you forget a hotkey for something. And that's not just for selecting things, that's for pretty much anything. So try to always remember that there are these text menus that you can typically get to options if you can't remember a hotkey for something in Blender. So always remember that you have this available to you. Occasionally you might find these menus collapsed, and if they're collapsed, instead of looking like the text like this, they'll look like this here with these three little lines, but you can always get to them by just clicking that icon wherever you see it. But I'll right click that and uncollapse those. And then also we can access that same select menu in object mode. So if I were to press tab to go to object mode, we can circle select, border select, which I was calling box select, which you could call either one. The terms are interchangeable. And we also have a few other selection choices such as random, mirror, and so you might want to play around with these and see what kind of cool stuff you might be able to do. So for instance, I could double right click over here, add a torus shape, and duplicate it a few times. And so if under select, we select random, we now just have a random selection of things, which this time it selected almost everything but that one torus shape there. But if I were to deselect everything and then try again, it's totally random, which this tool probably gets a lot more use if you're in edit mode. So if I were to select one of these toruses, press tab to go into edit mode, and then double click off here to deselect everything and then select random, then we get this nice random selection here, which in some situations you might want. So for instance, a cool thing we could do is after doing this random selection of faces here, because we are in face selection mode, you could press Control E to do an individual extrude, and we get some really interesting, weird looking shapes here, which is kind of neat. Also, we have checker deselect, which will do its best to try to form a checker pattern of all the mesh items or objects around it if we're in object mode. So if I were to tap A to select everything and then under select do checker deselect, then it's done its best to, in a mathematical way, deselect items in a checker pattern, related to it. So this would look a lot more obvious if we were like using a flat plane that we had just subdivided a bunch. But I could press Control E and get even more madness out of doing something like that. So that's kind of cool and, useful for generating chaos and madness when you sometimes need that, of course.